Well, this project is based on my PhD, and it came out of my master's at the University of Kent. And my master's supervisor actually suggested that I do a comparative project, because my my MA thesis was on a very little known travel account about a traveler in the South Pacific, and it was basically an 18th century sentimental novel in the South Seas. And so it transposed a European discursive formation into the South Seas, into the South Pacific, and it was a fascinating thing to work on. And I remember that my supervisors and the examiners were very thrilled about it. And then they suggested that I do a PhD, but simply doing something on the South Pacific wasn't innovative enough, because there were a lot of scholars at the time, like Markman Ellis, Vanessa Smith, and others, who Rod Edmond at my university as well, who had already done extensive work on the South Pacific. So it must have been something new. And the new thing was obviously a global perspective, with the then emerging field of Anglo-Ottoman, Anglo-Islamic studies. And so it just happened that we discussed a project and a proposal over a couple of days during lunch and over a cup of coffee. And then I suddenly had 2 pages of a PhD proposal. I applied to the University of Exeter, where Gerald McLean, who's a very eminent academic in my field, was also very thrilled about my proposal, and I won a scholarship. And yeah, that's how I came to do a PhD, sort of, you know, looking at the 18th century and having a global 18th century perspective. And this is how the book basically started, as an idea, 5 minutes over a cup of coffee and a casual conversation. Yeah. Well, these regions have very little in common at first sight, but then my MA supervisor, Donna Landry, wrote an article back in 2004 where she tries to theorize the concept of extreme travel. Extreme travel is very, very cumbersome, very difficult for the travelers. So let's say you're traveling in England or Germany at the time, and you embark on your grand tour, which was very, very usual for 18th century men. Before they would start their journey in life, they would go on the grand tour and, you know, get to know women, get to know different places in Europe, and a mentor would accompany them. That was a relatively painless kind of travel compared to what travelers in the Ottoman Empire, in the Mughal Empire, and Safavid Persia, and of course on the other end of the world in the South Pacific, in the Antipodes, had to go through. Bodily deprivations, pain, no water, no food. You know, there was always this threat of dying of an unknown disease, and hunger, thirst. Everything was just a problem at the time. It was so incredibly difficult to go far away, to leave the narrow purview of the European continent, and then to travel to a very powerful Islamic empire, where Europeans could not hope to call the shots at the time. And on the other hand, the Pacific was unknown. So the Ottoman Empire was an old and already familiar kind of land. You know, even if Europeans only knew it from the Bible and from Bible study, the South Pacific was a completely new area. So the contrast between these 2 regions was just striking. They had in common that they were both extreme. Bodily deprivations, thirst, hunger, and so on were waiting for the travelers. But then the Ottoman Empire was a kind of familiar territory. From biblical times, through Christianity in Europe, the Crusades, and so on, there was always an interaction between, let's say, the Levant and Europe, or Europe and the Levant. It was basically a twin challenge of fear and fascination that governed Euro-Islamic or European and Middle Eastern relations at the time. And then on the other hand, in the Antipodes, you know, the South Pacific, everything was new, everything was unknown. So these are the 2 things that make extreme travel such an interesting concept. On the one hand, both regions deprived the travelers of even the most basic comforts. But on the other hand, the Ottoman Empire was already familiar, and the South Pacific was the big unknown. Well, what I'm trying to do in my book is actually to write a revisionist history of the 17th and 18th centuries, because since the 1970s and 1980s, colonial discourse analysis and post-colonial theory has basically told us that there was one big narrative, and that is European domination over other parts of the world. And whilst that is absolutely true, it is a story of the 19th and early 20th centuries. We can say the age of high imperialism in Europe, when Britain and France, amongst others, were basically ruling the world and governing it according to their own designs. But earlier periods were completely different. So what we shouldn't do is just project the findings of colonial discourse analysis and post-colonial theory that fit the 19th and 20th centuries backward in time. Because you can imagine if a 16th century English traveler from, England at the time was just a peripheral nation in Europe, nothing else. There was no empire. If a traveler from that very small pre-imperial nation traveled to the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, or the Mughal Empire, these people were basically surprised by the imperial grandeur, by how huge these empires were, by how powerful they were, and the influence they wielded in Europe, in Africa, and Asia. So there was no way that Europeans could dominate other parts of the world in the 16th and 17th centuries, and even into the 18th century. This was not the case. So what I was trying to do is basically to say, hey, wait a second, this is colonial discourse analysis, post-colonial theory, and this is true for the 19th and 20th centuries, that European powers dominated the world and tried to rule others according to their own designs. But this is by no means true for other parts of the world, especially not for the early modern gunpowder empires, as they have been called, the Safavids, the Mughals, and the Ottomans. There was slavery starting in the early 17th century, but that was a westward expansion into the New World, into the Americas. And Europeans were relatively powerful over there because indigenous peoples didn't have guns or gunpowder. But if they went east into the Ottoman realm, stories were completely different. So I just wanted to write a new history of what it means to travel in the 17th and 18th centuries. So if you go to the New World, and if you are a Spanish conquistador, or if you are an English colonizer in North America, then probably the story is true that slowly but surely you can start building an empire. There's an imperial imaginary, then you start building colonies and so on, and you bolster and you buttress these outposts of your own civilization. But that is not the case. Maybe even in Africa on the coast, and when people went to get Africans for the slave markets in the New World. But this was by no means the case in the Islamic gunpowder empires of the early modern period. Europeans were not able to dominate or even to survey at all these empires. So it was much more a story of European inferiority compared to those empires at the time. So simply to project the 19th and 20th centuries back in time doesn't actually do the job. And Richmond Barber, amongst others, has alerted us to the fact that we should be very careful and always historicize what we are about to say. And I'm just trying to make a contribution to that new discourse in history where we are very precise with what we're trying to say. And I wanted to write a revisionist history of travel and expansion. Well, civility was a key notion in 17th and 18th century discourse of manners and social discourse. And I found a very, very interesting book from back in 1997 by Anna Bryson, where she traces different notions of civility in European and especially English social discourse. And I just took civility and transposed it to a global level. So what does civility mean? It actually means paying attention to others and being aware of the discursive and behavioral limits of your own culture. And in the early modern period, Europeans in the Ottoman Empire had to be civil because they couldn't hope to overcome this empire. They couldn't even hope to travel freely. You always had a guide, a so-called dragoman, with you. And so Europeans had to be civil. It was basically an intercultural coping mechanism. Whilst in domestic intercourse in England or Germany at the time, civility basically served to show your place in society on the social ladder and the social hierarchy. In the intercultural arena, it basically meant that you had to be civil, respect your host culture, and you could not hope to call the shots in this arena because, as I said, the Ottoman Empire especially was way too powerful so that Europeans could not hope to overcome that very, very powerful empire. And so civility just lent itself to a cross-cultural analysis of what I was trying to do. I found the term very fascinating, not only in Anna Bryson's book, also Anindya Roy published a book back in 2002 or 3, where he traced civility in Anglo-Indian writing. And recently, I think a year ago, a Cambridge academic published a huge book on civility. So civility is and has been for some time now a very popular notion and useful lens through which we can view social discourse and interaction, both in domestic and the intercultural arenas. So I just found it a useful theoretical tool. Well, I wanted to write a book for academic and general readers. It's not a book only for general readers because it is quite heavy on theory in some parts, but it's not only for academics. I just wanted to address both audiences as far as I could, because I do think that there should be complex theoretical discussions in the humanities especially. This is what the humanities do, what the humanities rely on. Basically apply philosophical terms to specific cultural problems or configurations. But at the same time, we have a duty to make these findings available to the reading public, because otherwise our discourse just loses its focus and purpose. If I'm not able to explain what I'm doing in a book, even if it's a very academic and dense, theoretically dense book, and if I can't explain it to a general reader, it sort of defeats the purpose in a way, because I do think that no matter how difficult, how specific certain problems are, be they scientific, be they problems in the humanities, we have to be able to communicate them to a general audience, because otherwise we're just locking ourselves up in an ivory tower, and I'm completely opposed to that. So I always have general readers in mind when I write.